On July 6, 1775, just weeks after the battles of Lexington and Concord ignited the American Revolution, the Continental Congress issued a remarkable proclamation. They encouraged all colonies to maintain law and order, as if the king's peace still prevailed, even while actively rebelling against the king himself. This created an extraordinary paradox. Americans were simultaneously declaring British law illegitimate, while desperately trying to prevent their own society from collapsing into chaos. They were fighting a war to overthrow established authority, while needing to maintain order in their own communities. And they were doing all of this without police forces, without a functioning court system in many areas, and without any clear consensus about who had the legitimate authority to enforce laws. So how did revolutionary America maintain law and order during 8 years of war, political upheaval, and social disruption? Who kept the peace when the peace itself was being shattered by revolution? And how did communities prevent criminal chaos while the very definition of crime was being rewritten in real time? Welcome to the paradox of revolutionary justice, where rebellion and order existed in uncomfortable tension, and where ordinary Americans had to invent new systems of law enforcement even as they fought to destroy the old ones. When the American Revolution began in 1775, it didn't just challenge British political authority, it shattered the entire infrastructure of colonial law enforcement and justice. Royal governors fled or were imprisoned. Crown-appointed judges resigned or were forced from office. Sheriff's commissions issued under royal authority became legally questionable. The courts that had administered justice for over a century ceased to function in many areas. This wasn't a simple transfer of power from one government to another. For several years, multiple competing authorities claimed legitimacy. British officials who maintained they still held legal authority, newly formed revolutionary governments that insisted they now held power, and local communities that often made their own decisions regardless of what either side claimed. The result was institutional chaos. Between 1775 and 1783, much of America operated in a legal twilight zone where the old system had collapsed but new systems were still being improvised. To understand what was lost, we must first understand what existed before the Revolution. Colonial law enforcement, as explored in previous episodes of this series, relied on a patchwork of amateur officials, constables, sheriffs, justices of the peace, and night watches. These positions were based on English common law traditions and derived their authority from the Crown, either directly or through colonial charters issued by the king. When Americans repudiated royal authority, they simultaneously undermined the legal foundation of these positions. A sheriff appointed by a royal governor no longer clearly had legitimate authority. Courts that operated under commissions from the Crown became legally ambiguous. Even town constables, whose positions predated royal authority, found themselves in uncertain terrain when the entire governmental framework collapsed. The Continental Congress, which convened in 1774 and declared independence in 1776, faced an immediate dilemma: how to maintain order while overthrowing the existing order. They couldn't simply abolish all existing laws and legal structures. Society would collapse. But they also couldn't claim those structures remained fully legitimate without undermining their own revolutionary cause. The solution was pragmatic compromise. The Continental Congress advised colonies and later, states, to maintain existing laws and legal procedures wherever possible, while replacing Crown authority with revolutionary authority. Sheriffs would continue to serve, but under commissions from revolutionary state governments rather than royal governors. Courts would continue to hear cases, but judges would be appointed by new state legislatures rather than the Crown. This transition was messy, inconsistent, and incomplete. Some states moved quickly to establish new legal frameworks. Others operated in legal limbo for years. areas that changed hands between British and American control multiple times during the war experienced repeated disruptions of their legal systems. The Revolutionary War itself created additional complications. When armies, whether continental, state militia, or British, occupied an area, military authority often superseded civilian authority. Martial law was declared in various locations at various times, suspending normal legal processes. Military officers found themselves acting as law enforcement, judges, and executioners. George Washington, as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, repeatedly grappled with questions about his authority to try civilians, punish military personnel for crimes against civilians, and maintain order in occupied territories. The presence of armies also created new crimes and new challenges. Desertion, treason, collaboration with the enemy, espionage, counterfeiting, and smuggling all took on new significance during wartime. Traditional law enforcement mechanisms were poorly equipped to handle these politically charged offenses. Perhaps the most vexing challenge was defining what constituted a crime in the first place. Was supporting the British government treason, or was supporting the rebellion treason? The answer depended entirely on who won, and for most of the war, that outcome was uncertain. Patriots treated Loyalists, those who remained loyal to the crown, as traitors and criminals. Loyalists viewed patriots as rebels and outlaws. Both sides used law enforcement mechanisms to punish their political opponents, often justifying personal vendettas and property confiscation as legitimate law enforcement. This politicization of crime and justice created a climate where law enforcement often meant political persecution, and where distinguishing between genuine criminality and political difference became nearly impossible. Beyond military conflict and political division, revolutionary America faced all the ordinary challenges of law enforcement: theft, assault, murder, fraud, domestic disputes, and property crimes. These everyday offenses didn't stop because a war was happening. If anything, the chaos and disruption of war made some crimes more common. Communities still needed mechanisms to address these offenses. But with courts disrupted, law enforcement officials of uncertain authority, and resources devoted to military rather than civilian needs, maintaining order became extraordinarily difficult. Into this chaotic environment stepped a variety of actors: militias, committees of safety, vigilante groups, military officers, and improvised local authorities, all trying to maintain some semblance of law and order without any clear consensus about who had the authority to do so or what laws they were enforcing. One of the first and most important mechanisms for maintaining order during the Revolution was the Committee of Safety, extralegal bodies that emerged in 1770–1775 to enforce revolutionary policies and maintain order as British authority collapsed. Committees of safety began forming in 1774 in response to the Coercive Acts, which Americans called the Intolerable Acts, British legislation designed to punish Massachusetts for the Boston Tea Party. These committees initially focused on enforcing the Continental Association, a non-importation agreement designed to economically pressure Britain, but they quickly expanded their mandate to include broader law enforcement functions. As royal authority crumbled, committees of safety became the de facto government in many communities, exercising executive, legislative, and judicial powers simultaneously. Committees of safety wielded extraordinary power with minimal formal legitimacy. They typically consisted of local leaders elected by town meetings or appointed by provisional revolutionary governments. Their authority derived not from law but from revolutionary fervor and community consent. Their methods included: committees monitored community members for suspicious behavior, particularly anything suggesting loyalist sympathies or violations of revolutionary policies. Those accused of disloyalty were summoned before committees, questioned often without legal representation, and forced to explain their actions and beliefs. Committees imposed penalties ranging from public humiliation to property confiscation to physical violence, all without formal trials. Committees enforced price controls, requisitioned supplies for the Continental Army, collected taxes for revolutionary governments, and prevented trade with Britain. The experience of Dr. Abner Beebe, a physician in Dutchess County, New York, illustrates both the power and the arbitrary nature of committee justice. In early 1776, neighbors accused Beebe of making loyalist statements and refusing to support the revolutionary cause. The local committee of safety summoned him for questioning. Records from the Dutchess County Committee show that Beebe was interrogated about his political opinions, his associates, and whether he had spoken against the Continental Congress. Beebe maintained he was politically neutral. He wanted no part in the conflict, but neutrality wasn't acceptable to the committee. They demanded he publicly declare his support for the revolution or face consequences. When Beebe refused on grounds of conscience, the committee declared him an enemy to the liberties of America, published his name in the newspaper as an opponent of independence, prohibited anyone in the county from doing business with him, effectively destroying his medical practice, threatened to confiscate his property if he didn't leave the area. Beebe eventually fled to British-controlled New York City, joining thousands of other refugees who sought protection from revolutionary authorities. His case demonstrates how committees of safety operated as law enforcement, courts, and instruments of political coercion, all without formal legal authority or procedural protections. While committees of safety filled a real vacuum created by the collapse of royal authority, they operated more like vigilante organizations than legitimate legal institutions. They had no legal training, no oversight, no appeals process, and no consistent standards for what constituted an offense or an appropriate punishment. In some communities, committees conducted themselves with relative restraint and fairness. In others, they became instruments of revenge, allowing personal grudges to be settled under the guise of revolutionary necessity. Property was confiscated, reputations destroyed, and people driven from their homes, all based on accusations that might have been motivated by genuine security concerns or by simple malice. As state governments solidified their authority in 1777, they gradually reclaimed law enforcement and judicial functions from committees of safety. New state constitutions established courts, appointed judges, and created clear procedures for law enforcement. But the legacy of committee justice lingered. The precedent that extralegal bodies could exercise coercive power in emergencies, that political loyalty could justify persecution, and that communities could bypass formal legal processes when motivated by sufficient fear or fervor. These lessons would resurface repeatedly in American history. The Continental Army, state militias, and British forces all faced a recurring question during the Revolution. What authority did military commanders have to punish civilians for crimes, and how should they exercise that authority? George Washington confronted this issue from the moment he took command of the Continental Army in June 1775. His troops were committing crimes against civilians: theft, assault, rape, destruction of property. Local communities demanded protection and punishment of offenders, but Washington's authority was military, not civilian. Did he have the right to try and punish soldiers for crimes against civilians? And what about civilians who committed crimes against the army? The first significant test came in June 1776 with the case of Thomas Hickey, a Continental Army soldier accused of participating in a conspiracy to assassinate George Washington and aid the British in capturing New York City. Hickey was arrested along with several alleged co-conspirators. Some were civilians, including New York Mayor David Matthews. The plot, if it existed in the form alleged, involved passing counterfeit currency, recruiting soldiers to defect to the British, and possibly poisoning or killing Washington. Washington faced a crucial decision. How should Hickey be tried? A court-martial had clear authority over military personnel for military offenses, but conspiracy to commit murder and treason had civilian dimensions, and the alleged co-conspirators included civilians who couldn't be tried by military courts. Washington chose to try Hickey by court-martial, arguing that the conspiracy to subvert the army made it a military offense. On June 26, 1776, Hickey was convicted and sentenced to death. On June 28, he was hanged before a crowd of approximately 20,000 people, the largest public execution in New York's history to that point. Mayor Matthews and other civilian suspects were handled differently. Matthews was arrested by revolutionary authorities but never tried. He was eventually exchanged in a prisoner swap. This inconsistent treatment revealed the legal confusion. Military personnel could be swiftly tried and executed by military courts, but civilian co-conspirators in the same alleged plot faced a different, more uncertain process. Washington repeatedly struggled with soldiers who committed crimes against civilians. His general orders are filled with commands prohibiting theft, violence, and vandalism. July 7, 1775. Any person who shall be convicted of plundering shall be punished with the utmost severity. November 5, 1775. Warning against the scandalous practice of plundering and making free with the property of the inhabitants. January 1, 1776. Threatening punishment for soldiers caught stealing from civilians. Yet enforcement was inconsistent. Courts-martial could punish soldiers, but penalties were often lenient, especially when armies desperately needed manpower. Flogging was common, execution rare except for the most egregious offenses or to make examples. New York civilian was accused of knowingly assisting Benedict Arnold's treason plot by ferrying British spy John Andre across American lines. Smith was tried by military court-martial in October 1780, despite being a civilian. His defense argued that military courts had no jurisdiction over civilians. The court disagreed, reasoning that Smith's offense directly affected military security and occurred in a military zone where civil courts weren't functioning. Smith was convicted, but later acquitted on appeal by a civil court, which ruled that the military court-martial had indeed lacked jurisdiction over a civilian. This ruling established an important precedent. Military justice couldn't simply replace civilian justice even during wartime, though in practice, the line remained blurry throughout the war. The Revolutionary War established patterns that would recur in future American conflicts, military authority expanding to fill vacuums created by war, military courts trying civilians in circumstances of dubious legality, and tensions between military necessity and civilian rights. Washington himself was acutely aware of these tensions. His correspondence reveals a commander struggling to maintain discipline without creating a military dictatorship, to punish genuine crimes without persecuting political opponents, and to respect civilian authority even when civilian authority barely existed. Perhaps no aspect of revolutionary law enforcement was more widespread or more legally questionable than the confiscation of Loyalist property by revolutionary state governments. Between 1777 and 1783, all 13 states passed confiscation acts seizing property from Loyalists who had fled or were deemed enemies of the Revolution. These acts were justified as punishment for treason against the revolutionary governments, economic warfare against Britain and its supporters, revenue generation for cash-strapped state governments, redistribution of land from political enemies to revolutionary supporters. The confiscation process typically involved identification of Loyalists, those who had fled to British lines, those who had actively supported Britain, or sometimes simply those accused of Loyalist sympathies. Legal proceedings ranging from formal trials to simple legislative declarations, declaring specific individuals guilty of treason or disloyalty. Seizure of their property by state officials. Sale of confiscated property at auction, with proceeds going to state treasuries. The Delancey family of New York provides a dramatic example. James Delancey, a wealthy landowner and merchant, remained loyal to Britain when the Revolution began. In 1776, he fled to British-controlled territory and actively supported the Crown, even raising Loyalist military units. In 1779, New York passed a Confiscation Act specifically naming James Delancey and other prominent Loyalists. The state seized his extensive properties in Westchester County and New York City, lands his family had owned for generations. These properties were then sold at auction. The process resembled law enforcement. Delancey was declared guilty of treason, a crime. His property was seized as punishment, and the state claimed to be acting through legal authority. But the reality was more complex. Delancey had no opportunity to defend himself. He was convicted by legislative decree while living under British protection. The trial was essentially a confiscation bill passed by the legislature with Delancey's name listed among others. The property sale generated significant revenue for New York's government and enriched well-connected buyers who purchased valuable properties at below-market prices. Delancey's crime was political loyalty to the government that had been legitimate just years earlier. While some confiscations targeted genuinely dangerous British supporters, many were motivated by greed, revenge, or political opportunism. Neighbors accused neighbors of loyalism to seize their land. Revolutionary officials used confiscation powers to enrich themselves and their allies. Accusations of loyalism were difficult to disprove, and the burden of proof fell on the accused. Neutral individuals who tried to avoid taking sides were sometimes declared loyalists simply because they hadn't actively supported the revolution. Connecticut's confiscation records show numerous cases where accusations were made by individuals who subsequently purchased the confiscated property, suggesting the accusations were motivated by desire for the property rather than genuine security concerns. Was this law enforcement? The states claimed it was. They were punishing treason, a capital crime under both English common law and new American state laws. Revolutionary governments insisted they were exercising legitimate authority to prosecute criminals, but it's difficult to distinguish this from legalized theft and political persecution. The criminals had committed no acts that were crimes under the government they recognized as legitimate. The trials often consisted of legislative declarations without evidence or defense. The punishment enriched those administering it, and the law was retroactive, declaring acts to be treasonous that weren't crimes when committed. This use of law enforcement mechanisms for political and economic ends illustrates how thin the line between justice and persecution became during the Revolution. The Revolutionary War's disruption of law enforcement had profound and lasting effects on American society, shaping both the immediate war period and long-term development of American legal and political culture. In areas where law enforcement collapsed most completely, crime increased dramatically. Contemporary accounts describe rising rates of theft, assault, and violence, particularly in regions that changed hands between British and American control, or where neither side maintained effective authority. The New Jersey neutral ground, the area between British-controlled New York City and American-controlled territories, became notorious for lawlessness. Armed bands operated with impunity, claiming to be either loyalist or patriot forces, but actually functioning as simple bandits. Residents couldn't seek protection from either side, because seeking protection from one made you an enemy of the other. Counterfeiting flourished during the war, with both patriot and British operators flooding the new American economy with fake currency. The weak law enforcement capacity of revolutionary governments made detecting and punishing counterfeiters nearly impossible. Perhaps the most damaging legacy was the establishment of precedents for using law enforcement and judicial mechanisms to persecute political opponents. Revolutionary governments demonstrated that law enforcement could be weaponized, that accusations of criminality could be deployed against political enemies, that confiscation of property could be justified as punishment for political beliefs, and that extraordinary powers could be claimed in the name of security. These precedents would resurface repeatedly in American history. The Alien and Sedition Acts of 1798, suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War, the Palmer raids after World War I, Japanese-American internment during World War II, and McCarthy-era political prosecutions all followed patterns established during the Revolution. Not all impacts were negative. The Revolution also demonstrated remarkable community resilience and innovation in maintaining order despite institutional collapse. Many communities created new mechanisms for resolving disputes, maintaining peace, and addressing crime without waiting for governments to provide solutions. Town meetings, citizen committees, and informal mediation became primary means of addressing conflicts. While these mechanisms lacked the formal legitimacy of courts, they often worked reasonably well at the local level. This tradition of community self-governance and skepticism towards centralized authority became embedded in American political culture. The Revolution taught Americans that they could govern themselves without British authority, and sometimes without much governmental authority at all. The Revolution established important precedents regarding military authority over civilians. Washington's careful approach to questions of military jurisdiction, trying to respect civilian authority even when it barely existed, set a pattern for American military leadership that generally, though not always, prevailed in subsequent conflicts. The principle that military authority should be subordinate to civilian authority, even during wartime, emerged from Revolutionary-era debates and conflicts. While this principle was frequently violated in practice, it remained an ideal that later generations could invoke. The revolutionary experience highlighted the need for clear, written legal codes and consistent judicial procedures. The inadequacy of improvised, politically motivated justice during the war motivated the legal reforms that followed. State constitutions adopted in the 1770s and 1780s included detailed provisions for courts, legal procedures, and law enforcement, reflecting lessons learned from the chaos of the war years. The U.S. Constitution's provisions regarding judicial independence, due process, and limits on government power similarly emerged from Revolutionary-era experiences with arbitrary authority. The very concept of constitutionalism, written documents that limit government power and protect individual rights, was partly a response to Revolutionary-era abuses of law enforcement authority. Americans who had seen committees of safety persecute neighbors, states confiscate property without due process, and military courts try civilians demanded constitutional protections against such abuses. The Revolutionary War's law enforcement challenges resonate powerfully with modern debates about justice, authority, and emergency powers. The revolutionary precedent of claiming extraordinary powers during emergencies recurs throughout American history. Every major crisis, wars, terrorist attacks, pandemics, prompts debates about how much authority governments should have and what civil liberties can be suspended in the name of security. The post-9/11 expansion of government surveillance powers, detention of suspected terrorists without trial at Guantanamo Bay, and the Patriot Act all echo Revolutionary-era patterns. Governments claiming that extraordinary threats justify extraordinary powers, and critics warning that emergency powers tend to outlast emergencies and be used for purposes beyond their ostensible justification. The COVID-19 pandemic similarly raised questions about government authority to impose lockdowns, vaccine mandates, and other measures, with debates often framing the issues in terms reminiscent of revolutionary-era tensions between collective security and individual liberty. The use of law enforcement and judicial mechanisms to target political opponents, which characterized much of Revolutionary-era justice, remains a recurring concern in modern America. Accusations that criminal investigations of political figures are politically motivated appear regularly across the political spectrum. Whether these accusations are valid in any given case, the concern itself reflects awareness that law enforcement can be weaponized as it was during the Revolution. The January 6, 2021, Capitol riot prosecutions provide a contemporary example of debates that parallel Revolutionary-era conflicts. Are these legitimate prosecutions of criminal conduct or political persecution? The answer depends largely on one's political perspective, exactly as determinations of treason during the Revolution depended on whether one supported the Crown or the rebellion. Questions about military authority over civilians persist. The use of military forces for domestic law enforcement, the detention and trial of suspected terrorists by military tribunals, and debates about martial law during civil unrest all revisit Revolutionary-era questions about the proper relationship between military and civilian authority. The Posse Comitatus Act, 1878, which generally prohibits using federal military forces for domestic law enforcement, was partly a reaction to abuses during Reconstruction, but it addressed concerns that trace back to Revolutionary-era experiences with military authority supplanting civilian authority. Modern debates about community policing, local control of law enforcement, and skepticism toward centralized police power reflect Revolutionary-era experiences with community-based law enforcement. The Revolution demonstrated both the potential and the problems of community-based justice. Communities can effectively regulate themselves and maintain order through informal mechanisms, but community justice can also become mob rule, persecution of minorities, and arbitrary exercises of power. Contemporary discussions about defunding or reforming police departments, empowering community alternatives to traditional law enforcement, and decentralizing authority often echo these revolutionary-era tensions without explicitly acknowledging the historical parallels. Perhaps the most important lesson from revolutionary law enforcement is how fragile legal order can be. The systems that maintain justice and prevent chaos depend on widely shared beliefs about legitimacy. When those beliefs shatter, whether through revolution, war, or loss of public confidence, legal systems can collapse with surprising speed. Modern America isn't facing revolution, but public confidence in legal institutions has declined significantly in recent decades. The revolutionary experience suggests that erosion of institutional legitimacy can have rapid and severe consequences for the rule of law, consequences that are difficult to reverse once they begin. Understanding how Americans maintained order, or failed to, during the Revolution offers both warnings and hope. Warnings about how quickly systems can break down, and hope that communities can improvise solutions even when formal institutions fail. The American Revolution presents a fascinating paradox. A society simultaneously tearing down one legal system while desperately trying to build another, fighting to overthrow authority while trying to maintain order, and redefining crime even as criminals exploited the chaos. For 8 years, Americans lived through a natural experiment in law enforcement without stable institutions. The results were mixed at best. Committees of safety filled vacuums, but often became instruments of persecution. Military courts maintained some order but violated principles of civilian authority. Property confiscations punished political enemies while enriching revolutionary governments and their supporters. Communities improvised solutions that sometimes worked and sometimes devolved into mob violence. Yet somehow, American society didn't collapse into complete chaos. Communities maintained enough order to function. The Continental Army remained relatively disciplined despite enormous challenges. Enough justice was administered, however imperfectly, that social bonds held together through years of disruption. This wasn't the idealized rule of law we aspire to today. It was messy, arbitrary, often unjust, and frequently motivated by political rather than legitimate legal concerns. But it was enough. Revolutionary America survived its own revolution and emerged with lessons about the fragility of legal order, the danger of politicized justice, and the need for clear constitutional limits on government power, especially emergency powers. The state constitutions drafted during and immediately after the Revolution reflected these lessons. They established independent judiciaries, guaranteed due process, protected property rights, and limited government authority to detain, prosecute, and punish. The U.S. Constitution and Bill of Rights codified these protections at the federal level. These weren't abstract philosophical commitments. They were practical responses to real abuses that Americans had experienced or witnessed during the Revolution. Arbitrary arrests by committees of safety, confiscation of property without fair trials, civilians tried by military courts, and political persecution disguised as law enforcement. Understanding Revolutionary-era law enforcement, in all its dysfunction and improvisation, helps us appreciate both the value of stable legal institutions and the danger of taking them for granted. It reminds us that the systems maintaining order are more fragile than they appear, that emergency powers claimed temporarily tend to become permanent, and that law enforcement can be weaponized to serve political rather than justice objectives. What do you think? Could modern America maintain order through a similar crisis that disrupted law enforcement and judicial systems for years? What lessons from revolutionary law enforcement apply to contemporary debates about police reform, emergency powers, and political polarization? Share your thoughts in the comments below. This concludes our 29-episode series on crime, justice, and law enforcement in early America. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into how communities maintained order before modern police forces existed. If you found this series valuable, please like, subscribe, and share these episodes with others interested in the complex history of American justice.